The promotion email arrives, and within seconds, his mind is already rehearsing failure in the new role. The flight is booked and paid for, and already he pictures the gate agent announcing a cancellation. This video explains that bracing and why staying to the end changes how it looks entirely. There is something most people never learn about this kind of mind, and it changes everything. From the outside, it looks like plain negativity, a mind that only sees what's wrong. It feels true because the bracing happens instantly, faster than any conscious choice to worry. Underneath, something entirely different is happening, quiet and deliberate, long before the worry shows. The second assumption is that this mind can never simply enjoy anything, not even good things. The joy is there, just carefully rationed, held at arm's length until it feels safe. There is a strange kind of discipline in a mind that refuses to be caught unguarded. People assume this mind is exhausting to be around, always finding the flaw in the plan. What looks like criticism is often care, a mind trying to protect everyone from the fall. Some assume this mind secretly hopes for disaster just to say it saw it coming. But nobody prepares for a disaster they secretly want. That impulse belongs to something else entirely. The real explanation is still ahead, and it reframes this entire pattern by the end. In the 1980s, two psychologists began studying students who braced for failure before every exam. These students predicted the worst possible outcome, out loud, before every test they sat down for. And then, again and again, those same students walked out with some of the highest scores. Psychologists Julie Norham and Nancy Cantor noticed the pattern and decided it deserved a closer look. Not every worried mind is broken. Some of them are simply doing careful, invisible work. In 1986, their research was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. Inside that paper was a name for a strategy nobody had properly described before. They called it defensive pessimism, and the name changed how psychology understood this kind of mind. It is defined as a motivated strategy, chosen and useful, not a flaw stumbled into by accident. People using it set expectations low on purpose before anything difficult even begins to unfold. Then the mind runs through every negative outcome it can imagine, one scenario after another, not to talk themselves out of trying, but to arrive already prepared for what might happen. The imagined disaster becomes a rehearsal, a map of every place things might go wrong. This is not about avoiding the challenge, it is about walking into it already prepared. The purpose is anxiety management, keeping the nervous energy from becoming too much to carry. Handled this way, anxiety never grows large enough to become debilitating or impossible to manage. Researchers found something surprising. Anxious people using this method consistently performed better than expected. It's not what it seems. The worry was never the obstacle. It was the method itself. Sometimes the mind knows exactly what it is doing, long before language catches up to it. The discovery had a name, but the mechanism underneath it still needed to be understood. The mechanism itself is simple. Rehearse the disaster in detail before it has any chance to arrive. Once the anxiety has somewhere specific to go, it stops circling and starts becoming useful. That same nervous energy converts quietly into preparation, checklists, backup plans, and careful extra effort. And with that preparation in place, performance on the actual day quietly improves each time. Now imagine interrupting that process, telling this mind to simply think positive instead. Norham's research found that forcing optimism onto this mind actively makes its performance worse. The strategy was never irrational. It simply asked to be understood on its own terms. Picture an umbrella folded closed, while dark clouds gather steadily overhead in the distance. Nobody stays dry by simply thinking sunny thoughts. Someone has to open the umbrella. Defensive pessimism is the umbrella, opened early on purpose, long before the rain even starts. This is not a rare trait tucked away in a small corner of the population. Norham estimates that roughly 25 to 30% of Americans use this strategy regularly. That means 1 in 4 people nearby may already be quietly running this exact system. It is not a fringe trait, it is a widespread and largely unnamed way of coping. There is a quiet relief in learning a habit finally has a name and a reason. This strategy also has to be told apart from something that only looks similar on the surface. Defensive pessimists are not hopeless, they are highly motivated, using dread as quiet fuel. This is entirely different from clinical depression, which drains motivation instead of sharpening it. The imagined worst outcome becomes fuel here, something to plan against, not surrender to. It is worth remembering, a mind that prepares for the worst is still a mind trying. But there is a shadow side to expecting the worst, one worth naming honestly and carefully. Researchers call it pessimism bias, the tendency to overestimate how likely bad things really are. This is different from the defensive strategy. This one distorts reality instead of preparing for it. Researchers at Oxford found that people with depression overestimate negative outcomes compared to others. This happens even when their own past track record clearly contradicts that gloomy prediction. The mind insists the pattern will break this time, no matter what the evidence shows. This bias reaches into relationships too, quietly shaping how closeness is allowed to grow. Expecting rejection quietly changes behavior, pulling a person back before anyone else has moved. That withdrawal creates distance, and the distance quietly confirms the fear that started it. This is the self-fulfilling prophecy, a quiet loop that feeds itself without anyone noticing. It's not what it seems. The fear isn't proven right. It quietly builds its own proof. There's a real cost to living permanently in a state of pre-disaster readiness. The body stays braced even when the disaster it prepared for never actually arrives. There's a difference between preparing wisely and living every day braced for impact. And that difference is exactly what the rest of this story is trying to explain. Chronic pessimism, the dispositional kind, carries its own long, well-documented toll over time. Research links it to more anxiety, lower life satisfaction, and even long-term heart health risks. One more layer is still coming, the part that finally explains why this feels so personal. People with this exact trait spend their whole lives being told something is wrong with them. But the research says something else entirely, and that difference is about to matter deeply. There is a specific tiredness that belongs only to a mind that never fully stands down. It is the cost of always being the one in the room who sees the risk. Nobody else in the room seems to be scanning for the exit or the failure point. That quiet vigilance can feel lonely, a private job nobody else agreed to share. Loneliness like this rarely comes from being disliked. It comes from being misunderstood entirely. American culture tends to celebrate optimism loudly, treating anything else as a character flaw. Phrases like, just think positive, get repeated constantly, as if worry were simply a choice. For a mind that runs on this strategy, that advice quietly breaks the very system helping it. There's a reason for that. This mind was never wired to run on borrowed sunshine. It runs on rehearsal, on preparation, on the quiet comfort of already knowing the plan. A culture built for extroverted optimism rarely leaves room for a mind that plans differently. And that mismatch is not a personal failing, it is simply a mismatch of expectations. Being tired of bracing does not mean the bracing itself was ever the wrong choice. The exhaustion is real, and so is the quiet competence hidden underneath every bit of it. Every prepared mind is carrying something invisible that nobody else has to think about. That weight is not proof of weakness, it is evidence of a mind constantly working. And it deserves recognition, not correction, not a lecture about looking on the bright side. The exhaustion and the competence live in the same place, tangled together, impossible to separate. And that changes everything about how this trait deserves to be understood going forward. Everything gathered so far leads toward one final reframe, waiting quietly just ahead. Here is the reframe, the one that quietly rewrites everything explained up to this point. Norm found that disrupting this strategy does not calm a defensive pessimist. It derails them. The worst-case thinking was never anxiety running loose, out of control, wandering without direction. It was anxiety under control, doing its job, in the only language this mind knows. This is not a broken brain scrambling for footing, searching blindly for some kind of safety. This is a brain running a strategy so old it never needed a name before now. The mental rehearsal of disaster is preparation wearing a disguise that looked like fear, understanding that shifts the whole picture, from something to fix into something to trust. The tightly braced posture slowly begins to loosen, one careful breath at a time. Relief settles in quietly, the kind that comes only after being fully understood at last. The bracing was never the problem. The absence of an explanation was the real one. This mind was never fighting itself. It was quietly protecting itself the whole time. That is the whole shift, from bracing in silence to finally understanding the reason why. So the rehearsal of disaster was never negativity. It was preparation wearing a familiar disguise. It was anxiety being turned, quietly and steadily, into something genuinely useful and productive. A mind doing exactly what minds are meant to do, keeping a person safe and ready, capable of showing up fully, even when the mind quietly expected something different to happen. There is one detail still worth holding on to, saved carefully until the very end. The most successful defensive pessimists never actually stop expecting the worst outcome entirely. They simply understand why they do it now, and that understanding changes everything else. They stop apologizing for a mind that was only ever trying to keep them safe. It's not what it seems, and now, finally, it never has to feel that way again. Here's one question worth sitting with, long after this particular video comes to an end. Is preparing for the worst a form of wisdom, or just a way of avoiding surprise entirely? Subscribe, then argue it out below. Wisdom in disguise, or just fear with better planning?